Welcome to a special episode of NFL News on the Boomer Bust channel. I'm your host, Terry, and today, doing a special episode because this is something that I did last year and really enjoyed it, had a good time, and so decided to bring it back and do it again this year. As most people that listen to me, you know, I don't live and die by stats. So this is, and one of the reasons I don't is because you can paint a bunch of different pictures with it. It doesn't tell the whole story. What I'm doing today is simply looking at one frame of reference, and that is quarterbacks against playoff competition. And so, again, that's just one way to look at it. That's not the end all be all. It's just one filter that I decide to look at. And so I'm going to go through a couple, I wouldn't say disclaimers, but framing it, and then we'll kind of dive into it. So first, we're starting off with the top 10. We're doing top 10 quarterbacks this past season by their quarterback rating. And so even though I don't really know what's in the quarterback rating, what goes into it, I do know that that is an NFL standard. Unlike a lot of advanced stats, I don't really follow those for the most part because I don't know what goes into it. And some stuff I don't believe you can even measure if you're not part of the coaching staff. So for me, the quarterback rating, again, is a traditional measurement. So that's what we went by. And this is our top 10. We got Aaron Rodgers at 1, Deshawn Watson, Mahomes, Allen, Tannehill, Brees, Russ Wilson, Kirk Cousins, Tom Brady, and Derek Carr. I didn't go back and look at last year's episode. I meant to, but I just didn't get around to it. But one thing I do know is Tom Brady wasn't on that list and Lamar was, so Lamar is off this list. And Lamar, initially when I was doing it, I had him on here, and then I realized Derek Carr had a higher rating than him. So Derek Carr makes it again, and that was one last year that some people were surprised by. But anyway, 300 attempts at least. I think there was one quarterback that might have been in this list that didn't have 300 attempts, but wasn't even close. Everybody's played, most people have played 16. One person played less than 15, and that's Drew Brees. And so, you know, pretty solid list. That's what we're going with. Now, the first filter that we're going to look at, or, I already did the analysis, but the first thing we're going to look at is who played the most competition. Who played the most playoff competition, I should say. And so when we switch that list over, it looks something like this, where we have Deshawn Watson at 1. We got Kirk Cousins, Tannehill, Carr, Rodgers, Brady, Allen, Brees, Russ, and then Pat Mahomes. So obviously, Allen and Brees are tied, and then Russ and Pat Mahomes are tied as well. I don't know why, but seeing their names out of order it throws me off, and I feel like I forget who they are. But anyway, so Pat Mahomes and Russ Wilson only played 4 games. Now, most of these all these stats really are averages from those games, so you still can compare apples to apples. But this does set the context so you know. And I would say one thing that stood out to me was Mahomes. Well, really the top 3 in general, but not Mahomes, the top 3, but Watson playing 10 games against playoff teams, which was way more than any last year. And Cousins had 9, so he's close. But one thing you got to realize, again, AFC South, they had 2 playoff teams as well, so there's that. But that's kind of how that shakes out as far as who played playoff teams. And so the next thing we're going to look at, we're going to go attempts, who's throwing against playoff teams. So this is the original list as far as attempts per game. This is just your overall attempts. And Pat Mahomes throws. Like, Pat Mahomes and Brady were way up there. Not just even average per game. I mean, obviously they are average per game, but their total was just it was further than, pretty much everybody else. So yeah, Brady and Pat Mahomes was throwing the ball this year. So that was one of the things that stood out. But when you move it to attempts per game against playoff teams, the list changes a little bit. So the top three actually stay the same, where you got Mahomes and Brady. They still lead. They still, I mean, and it kind of makes sense. It's kind of intuitive, but not always, especially with Mahomes only playing 4 games. But when you look at Mahomes, and we'll look at this a little later, for a lot of these players, their numbers go up against playoff teams. And so again, when you're doing analysis with any type of stats, it doesn't give you the answer, but it should lead to more questions. So, naturally you'd be like, well, why is that? I would probably say, typically maybe you're in I wouldn't say a tighter game, but maybe especially for, Chiefs or Bills, you got a team that can score with you more. And so either they're keeping up with you and it's more of a shootout, or maybe you're coming from behind and you got to catch up. And we know the Chiefs had to do that a number of times. So there's a couple different ways. And it wasn't too much movement. Carr moved up 2 spots, throwing a little more, and Brees moved up a spot. But Russ Wilson is the only one that went down, and pretty decently, 3 spots, where he was not throwing as many passes against playoff teams as he was originally. So overall, looking at it, our quarterbacks that throw more against playoff teams than they do against non-playoff teams would be Drew Brees, Deshaun Watson, Derek Carr, Pat Mahomes, and Tom Brady, who all averaged a higher clip, I would say. And Josh Allen, kind of a, I guess, honorable mention. He tied. His was the exact same per game. So there you go there. But again, these are the ones that threw it more. And I would say for the most part, everybody was like 1 or 2 points up against, or not points, attempts. But Mahomes, and he was up 2 attempts, but 41 attempts against playoff teams. That's a lot of throwing. And again, not a definitive answer, but you think about the Chiefs' defense, and when they're going against better teams, his defense unit is good enough to win the Super Bowl with, but they're not like world beaters. And so that's something you could think about. So that's who's throwing the ball, who's completing the ball. When we go to this list, our overall list, you got Pat Mahomes at the top as far as who got the most completions per game this year. And then Brady and Josh Allen are tied. Deshaun Watson and Russ Wilson are tied. And then Derek Carr, Drew Brees, Aaron Rodgers are all tied. Then Kirk Cousins, and bringing up the rear is Tannehill. So again, not too shocking there as far as what you probably would think when it comes to completing passes. A little bit difference, and this is where you can really compare certain stats, and I'm not really doing that here. I'm just kind of giving you more of an overview. But you think about some of these people throw a lot, but might not be completing a lot. But you got Mahomes, who throws a lot, completes a lot. So there's that. So now let's filter it. Playoff teams. Now Mahomes is still number 1. And now you got Watson and Derek Carr are tied for number 2. And I just realized I didn't do the plus or minus correctly, but anyway, we'll still continue to go. So then Josh Allen drops down a little bit as Derek Carr moves up, and Watson moves up a little bit as well. So, and then Drew Brees moves up, I would say a decent amount. I mean, +3. He jumps up with against playoff teams, and Tom Brady drops down. And again, he's tied for second throwing the ball or completing the ball overall. But then when you're talking about playoff teams, he drops below 3 other quarterbacks. And then Russ Wilson drops as well. Aaron Rodgers drops just a little. And then Kirk Cousins and Tannehill is still below. So a little bit of a shift, which is kind of interesting when you look at it. Again, you think Mahomes kind of continued to show he throws a lot, completes a lot, and against playoff teams still completes a lot. Now, Brady throws a lot as well, completes a lot, but then when you're talking about filtering it to playoff teams, then it drops off a little bit. And I'm a Brady fan, not trying to hate. Obviously, these are just the numbers, but that's something to look at. So then overall, these are the quarterbacks that are completing more passes per game against playoff competition than they are against non-playoff competition. And I would say for Mahomes, that number probably stands out a little more because he's completing 3 more passes against playoff competition than non-playoff competition. And I mean, it can be skewed a little bit because, again, he only had 4 games. So he could have had a monster game against one of them, and that skews the numbers a lot. But, yeah, I mean, it could go the other way as well where, okay, you don't have as much of a sample size, so the numbers could be lower. And, again, when you talk about playoff teams, but Mahomes' numbers for the most part seem to be up. All right, so those are the completions, but let's look at the percentage as far as, so now putting those two together, throwing and completing, these are our top 10 in completion percentage. We got a straight top 10 here. Aaron Rodgers being number 1, Brees, Watson, Allen, Russ Wilson, Kirk Cousins, Derek Carr, Pat Mahomes, Tom Brady, and then Tannehill at 10. So then when we filter it and look at the movement for against playoff teams, now we got a good amount of movement where Pat Mahomes goes up 7 spots. And that, as I mentioned again, his numbers are pretty, I wouldn't say significant. I mean, they are in terms of stats, but like nothing that will pop out to you. But his numbers go up against playoff teams. And so he moves up 7 spots. Watson moves up 1. Carr moves up 4 spots. And so that's significant to me. I mean, completions do tell you, but completion percentage, when you put the attempts in there as well, to say that he's just, I wouldn't even say being more accurate. People say accurate with completion percentage. That's not exactly the same, but you can see that he's performing better, at least against those playoff teams. Aaron Rodgers drops down 3 spots, and so does Drew Brees. Little bit of eye-opening there. And then Josh Allen dropped down 3 spots, and so does Russ Wilson. And then you got Tom Brady and Tannehill staying where they were at the bottom. So interesting to note, once again. And so the quarterbacks that are completing have a better completion percentage when they play playoff teams is Deshawn Watson, Pat Mahomes, and Derek Carr. So, I mean, that pretty much speaks for itself. But, I mean, you know, and again, you could think about different reasons as to why that might be. But I would say, again, Mahomes didn't play a lot. Watson played the most against playoff teams. And Derek Carr was pretty up there as well. So now we're moving on to yards. So that's efficiency. Let's look at just, you know, gross yards. or this is per game, but who's putting the ball in the air. Because it's one thing to throw the ball, it's one thing to complete it, but you could also have a bunch of completions and not have that many yards, not really putting it anywhere. But as I would think most of us know, our regular top 10 overall, Mahomes is number one. Mahomes, they put the ball up this year. I think that's safe to say. They put the ball up this year. And then you got Watson and at number 2. Then you got Tom Brady, Josh Allen, Derek Carr, A-Rod, Kirk Cousins, Russ Wilson, Drew Brees, and then Ryan Tannehill at the bottom. So then when we filter it as through our playoff teams, we have 1, 2, 3, and 4 all stand the same. Now, one thing I will say about this, well, I'll get to that a little later. But Russ Wilson moves up 5. His yards per game against playoff teams was a little better, or at least, it was better, but he just moves up in terms of the list. And actually, I wouldn't even say it was better. It wasn't better, but he does move up the list. And this is where you got to kind of break things down, but we'll get to that. Aaron Rodgers stays the same. Brady drops 4 spots. So his games in terms of yardage and output was much better against non-playoff teams, or at least higher. Brees moves up 1, Cousins drops 2, and Tannehill stays the same at the bottom. So the 2 quarterbacks that have more yards per game versus playoff teams is Pat Mahomes and Derek Carr. Now, here's one thing that's interesting. So, number one, Pat Mahomes, as I already said, he has more yards per game, but he has a lot more yards per game. Like, he has almost 15 more yards per game, or right around there, 16 yards more per game against playoff teams. So he averages 332 yards against playoff teams, which is, I would say, just a significant number, period, because nobody else averaged more than 300 yards against playoff teams, and he averaged 332. Then you got Carr, who was 5 more yards per game, but still better. And then, like I said, someone like a Russ Wilson, he falls, like when you look at the list, he goes up in that list. But if you look at his yardage, it's almost 20 yards less against playoff teams than his normal yardage. But again, this is just how he falls within these 10 quarterbacks. So again, that's why you got to really understand the stats, because Russ Wilson moved up the list, which means other people really weren't putting up great numbers against playoff teams. But at the same time, that doesn't mean he was better against playoff teams. He was just better than the other quarterbacks. And Brady's had a significant nosedive. That's probably the one that stands out to me, where he averaged 290 a game, but then against playoff teams, he averaged 238. So we know he went down some spots, but the overall output was a significant drop off as well. So then we go to touchdown. So this is our overall touchdown group. As far as just how many touchdowns you got. Aaron Rodgers led. Brady and Russ tied. Mahomes at 3. Josh Allen, Kirk Cousins, Watson and Tannehill tied at 6. Then you got Derek Carr, and Drew Brees is last. Now, again, keeping in mind, Drew Brees played the least amount of games out of all these people. So that's something to consider as well. And so Aaron Rodgers led with 48, which was significantly higher than everybody else. Now we're going to look at touchdown percentage against playoff teams. Like, what percent of your touchdowns came against playoff teams. And so we got Drew Brees at number 1. And Drew Brees had, sorry, actually I didn't filter that other way. So Drew Brees had 63% of his touchdowns come against playoff teams. Now you see he moved up 9 spots. Overall touchdowns last on the list, but percentage, like who's scoring against playoff teams, he moved all the way up to number 1. Then you got Derek Carr, who had 59% of his touchdowns come against playoff teams. And then Deshawn Watson, 51%. Ryan Tannehill, 45%. Kirk Cousins, 43%. Aaron Rodgers, 38%. Josh Allen, 35%. Pat Mahomes, 32%. Tom Brady, 25%. Only a quarter of his 40 touchdowns came against playoff teams. And then Russ Wilson with 10%. 10% of his 40 touchdowns, obviously 4 touchdowns, came against playoff teams. And then what's interesting about Russ Wilson is that he only played 4 playoff teams, so that averages to a touchdown each game, as far as the average. So a lot of movement. And I think this is really where you get some interesting perspective. Again, Aaron Rodgers, a lot of touchdowns. When you just filter it to playoff teams and like what's the percentage, middle of the pack. And Brees shoots up, so does Derek Carr and Watson and Tannehill. Tannehill didn't throw a lot of touchdowns, but the ones he did were against playoff teams. And then you got Russ Wilson, who threw a lot of touchdowns, and very little of them came against playoff teams. And so I think Pat Mahomes part of that, as well as Russ Wilson. They only had 4 games against playoff teams, but still, it kind of gives you a little bit of perspective. So now the same as interceptions. This is reverse, so least amount of interceptions. You had Aaron Rodgers, who threw the least amount. Tied for second was Brees and Mahomes. Again, Brees didn't play as many games. Watson and Tannehill tied for third. Then Carr, Josh Allen, Brady, and then Cousins and Wilson tied for the most interceptions out of the group, which was at 13. So those are the people that weren't really throwing interceptions. Now, this one, you got to kind of understand the logic. Interception percentage against playoff teams. And again, depending on how you look at numbers, you can filter it different ways. For me, I feel like if I have a quarterback and he's thrown picks, I'd rather those be against good competition. And again, that really doesn't have a bearing on the game. Like, yes, in the game, you don't want to throw picks, but when I'm looking over it, I'd rather say, is my quarterback throwing 5 picks against a really bad defense, or did he throw 5 picks against a playoff type defense? And so that's something you got to think about. So for me, that's the way I rated it. So number 1 was Kirk Cousins. He threw 92% of his interceptions went against playoff teams. That means that for him, only 1 interception was against a non-playoff team. All those other interceptions were against playoff teams. And then Aaron Rodgers drops down 1 spot. He threw 80% of his interceptions, which he had 5 interceptions. So 4 of them came against playoff teams. Deshawn Watson, he moves up. 71% of his interceptions that he threw came against playoff teams. And those were significant by far. The rest of them, Brady was 58%, Tannehill 57%, Carr 56%, Josh Allen 50% on the nose. That's right around where you probably want it, somewhere in the 40s to 50s. Then you get to Russ Wilson, who threw 38% of his 13 interceptions against playoff teams. Again, he moves up in the list, but not necessarily a good stat line. And then you got Brees, who threw 17% of his picks against playoff teams, only one. And then Pat Mahomes, of his 6 interceptions, none of them were against playoff teams. Now, the one thing I will say about Mahomes and a couple other people, you got to realize the Dolphins didn't make the playoffs. While they won 10 games and they had a really good defense, they didn't make the playoffs. Obviously, other teams that didn't make playoffs probably had good defenses too, but the Dolphins is, I think, one big factor that you got to take into context here, because then that would really change the numbers for some of these guys, including the number of playoff teams they play. But this is what I'm talking about. You look at Kirk Cousins and you look at Russ Wilson. Now, we all know who people probably think is the better quarterback, who had the better year, blah, blah, blah. But they both threw 13 interceptions. Would you rather that be Kirk Cousins, where 12 came against playoff teams? Now, maybe not, because you're like, those are the teams you need to beat so you could win. Or Russ Wilson, where only one was against a playoff team. Or not one, but he had 38%. So most of them were against non-playoff teams. So that, again, that's a philosophical. And for me, I'd rather my quarterback throw picks against competition. And so when you look at that group, interception percentage versus playoff teams, which I already kind of mentioned, these three stand out their numbers are way higher than anybody else. When they were intercepted, it was against playoff teams. So then we come to the last part where we're talking about the QB rating, which is what we started with. Here's our top 10 for QB rating. This is how they're ranked overall, and whatever goes into the QB rating. Now, how is that adjusted? And this is this is their overall QB rating. So how is their overall QB rating against playoff teams? So now when we go to that, shifts around quite a bit. Mahomes goes up 2 spots. So Mahomes, played pretty well against playoff teams. Aaron Rodgers, he moves down 1 spot. Still good, just not the best out of the group. Brees moves up a good amount, 3 spots. And then Derek Carr shoots up 6 spots toward the bottom, or really at the bottom, and then all the way up the pack when it comes against playoff teams. Deshawn Watson goes down 3 spots. And his is interesting because you think most of the other stats, when you talk about playoff teams, he did pretty well. But when you talk about his overall rating together, goes down. And that includes other stuff like sacks and whatnot. Josh Allen went down 2 spots, didn't perform as well. Ryan Tannehill went down 2 spots, didn't perform as well. Cousins, right where he was. Russ Wilson down 2 spots. And then Tom Brady down 1 spot. So overall, Tom Brady didn't move a whole bunch. His rating out of this group was at the bottom. Not say, again, these are still the best, but his rating was towards the bottom, and then he was towards the bottom here. But when you look at the raw numbers, it is a significant dip for him and Russ Wilson. So Russ Wilson's rating against playoff teams was 79.7. And Tom Brady's were 78.2. Not only were they the only ones in the 70s, they were the only ones below 95. So Tom Brady's his overall rating dropped from 102.2 down to 78.2. And Russ's went from 105.1 down to 79.7. So they had significant drops when they were playing against playoff teams in terms of their quarterback rating. And then lastly, the 3 that had better quarterback ratings against playoff teams, Pat Mahomes, Drew Brees, and Derek Carr. And so, something to think about. I mean, Drew Brees, he was still middle of the pack. Even with less games, he had 5 games against playoff teams. So he's still middle of the pack. Derek Carr had 7. He was towards the top. And again, Mahomes had 4, which was tied for least. But when they play playoff teams, they play better overall. And so you could take all those different stats how you want to and kind of play around with it. But just going by the NFL's QB rating, these were the top 10 quarterbacks. And then looking at playoff competition, some of these guys definitely differed. So interesting to look at, in my opinion. So that's it for me. Go down in the comment section. Let me know what you think. Share around, get the conversation started. Thumbs up, subscribe, and thank you for listening.